You're listening to Dare to Transform, where we find the vision, dedication, and motivation behind inspiring stories of transformation. This is episode number 3, Learning to Fight and Find Your Way. I'm your host, Angela Harris, founder of Work of Heart, bringing you a Missing Link Technologies production. My guest today is someone who I've known for a very long time, the one and only Nic Sulsky. Nic is currently the president of Monkey Knife Fight, the fastest growing daily fantasy sports company on earth. Nic has worked with some of Canada's biggest brands, ranging from TSN, CBC and Rogers to the CFL, Puma, and the Atlantic Ballet of Canada. His current leadership position in the sports gaming industry was fostered while consulting with TSN when he created and co-hosted the Fantasy Hockey Report on tsn.ca, the first broadband fantasy sports show. He is a frequent interactive digital media emerging technology panelist, lending his expert opinion in the developing category of multi-screen gaming and entertainment. Nic is also a cancer fighter, diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 2009. Nic continues to kick its butt day in and day out with a regimen of exercise, nutrition, positivity, and good old-fashioned screw you stubbornness. Nic, welcome to Dare to Transform.
Thank you for having me. You forgot one very important thing from my bio.
Yes.
Work of heart speaker. Come on now.
Yes, exactly.
Stay on brand here, right?
I know. I think you probably have like that. That's probably at the top of your resume right now, right?
Well, I have updated my resume since coming to the beautiful city of London last month.
I hear you. So I would love if you could share a bit of an introduction of yourself. I mean, I did your bio, but it would be awesome if you could tell us who you are, what you do today, how you got started, that kind of thing, so the audience has a better idea of who Nic really is.
Well, I hope this is a long podcast. I mean, ultimately, so I guess the question, Angela, and do you prefer Angela or Scrange on this podcast?
Yes. Well, see, we probably need to explain to them what Scrange was.
So Scrange is a mysterious ancient nickname.
Yes, it's a mysterious nickname that a lot of people in the business world don't know about. So
there you go. So I will shed the veil of mystery. We for all of your lovely listeners out there, the two of us became acquainted at the incredible Mount Allison University.
Yes.
I won't say what years, because then that would date us.
And I wouldn't even be able to tell you what they were, in fact.
Exactly. And the two of us both played rugby, and of course, when you played rugby, you had nicknames. And
exactly.
Yours was Scrange, and mine, because I was the lone Jewish rugby player in Mount Allison, and perhaps one of the only Jewish people at Mount Allison at the time, to be quite candid, my nickname kind of played around that motif. I think Goldberg is probably the most popular one. I like to think it was because of the wrestler back in the 90s who was big and had a goatee, right, and strong.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I don't think that's what they were.
No. I should inject and say that by no means is this meant to be a totally unedited, uncensored podcast, right?
Yes, I do swear. So to all of your listeners out there, I will apologize in advance, because I fucking swear like a trailer sometimes.
So there we go. First F-bomb. Boom.
So I think the question, and for the sake of this podcast, I will call you Scrange, just because I don't know what my brain would do if I had to shift that.
I know, right? Yes. So let me ask the question again.
Sure.
So tell me a little bit. Let's talk about entrepreneurship.
Yep.
And I will ask you a few more questions as we go along about your cancer fight and how that all has impacted your life. Does that sound good?
Sounds perfect. Okay, so
awesome.
So it's funny, entrepreneurship, I think, I mean, it's kind of nature versus nurture, right? I think some people are born with it and some people aren't. And I think being born with it, for me, it was lack of fear. Right? Being able to accept the fact that you're going to get no's and not being scared just to do shit. So, my story really literally begins as soon as university ended. I graduated Mount A, and I was fortunate enough to play in something called the Maccabea Games, which is the Jewish Olympics. And I played rugby for Canada. This was literally right after I graduated Mount A. And of course, the whole plan was grad school. I was going to be a lawyer and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
I went to the Maccabea Games, and I realized right after university that my heart wasn't really in going right to grad school. So I ended up meeting some Australians who were also playing rugby, and they convinced me to go to Australia and play rugby with them. So I was like, all right. So I decided to go to Australia, take the year off. And Australia is a great backpacking country. And so the idea was, I'll go play rugby and then I'll go backpacking. Got to Australia, and about after 3 weeks of playing rugby down there, I realized that being a fairly decent Canadian rugby player means you're a pretty shitty Australian rugby player.
I was just gonna say, yeah.
Yeah, and ultimately the idea of, dedicating 5 hours, for 5 days a week to a sport where I was now like third, fourth division. I was making money or anything. I was like, screw this. But Australia was great. And to be completely candid, I was 21, Australian women like Canadian men.
Yes, there you go.
So I was like, yeah, I think I might have some fun and travel around the country a little bit. So basically, my father, I had to get a job, right? So my father works in the clothing industry, and so I've never done anything in the clothing industry at that point. But I was like, I've heard my dad talk in meetings and stuff like that. I'll go try and get a job in a clothing store. So I got at a meeting with Esprit, which was a clothing label. It's not really around much anymore. And I talked myself into becoming a salesperson for them. So I was one of the only guys and it was a female-only clothing chain at the time. So I started selling clothes in Australia, and I ended up basically traveling wherever I needed to go. I would just go and pick up hours at different stores. After about 7 months there, I moved to Perth. I started in Sydney, moved my way over to Perth. And by the time I got to Perth, the people at Esprit were like, well, you want to manage one of our stores? We really like you. And I was like, okay. But then about 3 weeks later, I was like, I'm a backpacker. I don't want responsibility. So I quit that job, and then I got another job working but that, ultimately, that's kind of got my brain into, you can kind of do whatever you want to do if you're able to talk, if you're confident in yourself, and you have a goal. And, you basically just got to convince people that to give you a chance, and then you have to prove to them that you are what you said you were. So I ended up, I finished my Australian trip. I still wasn't ready for what I wanted to do with my next career. So I went and I became a ski bum for a year in Mont Tremblant in Quebec.
Okay.
And at that point, I was, after traveling, I was very into writing and thinking about getting into television and film. But I didn't know how to do it. So I was working in Tremblant, ironically managing a video store. I think I did that because I love the movie Clerks, and there's a character in that movie called Randall who manages the video store. And I think if anyone has seen that movie Clerks, I kind of patterned my life after some of the Kevin Smith's banter at that point. But anyway, so I'm managing the video store, working at Tremblant, and one day I'm on a chairlift. And I'm, as you can probably get a sense, Scrange, you've known me for a long time. Your listeners have now heard me for about 6 or 7 minutes. I talk a lot. And I'm not scared to talk. Ever. So and by all means, tell me to slow down or to shut up if I'm rambling on too much. But I'm on a chair.
I would never do that.
Oh,
I'm joking.
I think you've yelled at me a couple times, but
I'm pretty sure.
It was probably at 2:30 in the morning, and it probably involved kicking me out of a bar or something like that. So, ultimately, I was on a chairlift one day, and I just, randomly started having a conversation with these two ladies who were on the chairlift, and they asked me what I wanted to do with my life. And I told them, I'm really into writing. I kind of like the idea of getting into film and television. And they ended up being, I think they were Canadian producers of television. They said, have you ever heard of the Canadian Film and Television Production Association, something called the CFTPA? And I was like, no. And they said, well, they run a program that's funded through Heritage Canada to allow young people to get internships at a number of different organizations across the country. And they said, you should look into that. And I was like, that sounds good. So I looked into that. Ultimately, I ended up getting an internship through that conversation. I ended up getting an internship at a place called the Canadian Screen Training Center in Ottawa. And so that was the beginning of what I usually only refer to this with my wife, but now I've started making it a little bit more public, kind of my life business philosophy, which is something called harness the randomness. Right. You never know what's going to happen in life, who you're going to talk to, what you're going to hear. But if you're the kind of person that's open-minded and not scared to say no, or not scared to kind of just ask questions or talk to people, you have no idea what one conversation can lead to, or what one meeting could lead to, or what one idea could lead to. So, that was kind of the beginning of all of this, and it's transferred into Ottawa. So at that point, I moved to Ottawa. I've been doing an internship at a place called the Canadian Screen Training Center. It wasn't, I was just kind of organizing stuff and helping the marketing people. One day I was organizing or helping to put together a kids television production seminar, and it was being hosted by two producers of Degrassi Junior High, Kathy Lee Porter and Virginia Thompson. I think they may have actually been the creators of Degrassi Junior High as well. I can't remember. Anyway, my job during this seminar was to just wrangle. They had a kids focus group, like a focus group of a bunch of like 6 to 10-year-olds. I grew up in a big family. I went to sleepaway camp my entire life. I worked at sleepaway camp. I've always loved kids. I absolutely love kids. So I was just kind of keeping the focus group entertained and making them comfortable and making the kids be, feeling open enough to kind of participate in this focus group. At the end of the focus group, the two producers came up to me and they said, "Hey, who are you? What do you want to do in this life? What do you want to do in television and film?" And I said, "I don't really know." I at that point, like I said, I was addicted to Kevin Smith and that's sort of witty banter. So of course, in my mind, I had illusions of grandeur of writing the next great kind of indie comedy. And they said, "You should, what about kids television? You're really great with kids. What about doing something like that?" And I was like, that's kind of interesting. And literally I was walking home from that seminar after listening to what they had suggested to me, and I came up with an idea for a kids television show. And
Amazing.
And I was like, okay, this is a pretty good idea. And I started telling some people about this idea. The lesson that I learned at that point that they told me that literally has rang true from a television production perspective is good content is produced by people who are passionate about what stories they want to tell. So
absolutely, that applies to everything.
100%. If you're,
right?
I'm an extraordinarily passionate person, and people want to buy things from passionate people because it's going to sound a little bit, it's going to sound bullshit, but if you're passionate about something, whether it's real passion or fake passion, people are going to buy into that a hell of a lot more, because if they think that you actually believe what you say, well, obviously you're a way better salesman in that perspective. Ultimately, I also put all my cards on the table. I'm blunt. I don't believe in bullshit. If I'm selling something that you don't like, well, sorry, if I can't sell something I don't like. Right. Because it will be extraordinarily obvious. If I can't handle bullshit. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy. So at that point, I'm walking home, and as I just said, I grew up in sleepaway camp. I'm walking home, I'm like, oh, sleepaway camp. That's an awesome experience. I think there should be a television show made about the experiences of kids at sleepaway camp. So I came up with this idea, and I started talking to people about it, and everyone was like, yeah, it sounds like a really good idea. So I was able to raise some money to do this television show through some family and friends, my father especially. The reality is most great entrepreneurs, for whatever it's worth, I should say many entrepreneurs who get started, for whatever, a lot of them do have support from their family. The reality is I have so much respect for entrepreneurs that literally do it from scratch with no support from their family, their parents, their friends. Ultimately, what I do now has nothing to do with that, but I got started because my father and some of his friends believed in my idea and were willing to help me get started.
Incredible. But here's the thing, Nic. So, a couple things that you've said so far, and, there are things that I talk about a lot too. I think that, it's, first of all, it's about creating your own opportunities, right? And it's about having, when you have an idea, it's talking about it and letting yourself imagine the possibilities of it, and then keeping regardless of how you're going to do it or who's going to help you do it, don't stop talking about it or thinking about what it could possibly be, because you don't know how it's going to happen. Well, and yes, you're right. Some people have family and, access to money or connections or whatever. Some people don't. But at the end of the day, you might be sitting on a chairlift in Tremblant, and all of a sudden the person next to you has the money, connections, opportunities, access or whatever it is that you need, right?
Well, I think that's the key. The key isn't the money. The key
No.
is the key is the willingness to put your ideas out there. Because
Right.
the reality is, an idea you're going to put out there into the world, there's going to be a lot of people who think it's a bad idea, straight up. And
Absolutely.
you need to have thick skin. Ultimately,
Hmm.
the other, the other characteristic that I think is extraordinarily important, both for an entrepreneur, but also for any leader, because the reality is any entrepreneur
Hmm.
is a leader, right? They need to
Absolutely.
evolve themselves into that. And any good leader, especially in this day and age when you're trying to grow business, needs to understand what their weaknesses are. And it's
Right.
not only weaknesses of what they're, everyone has strengths and weaknesses.
Hmm.
It's in what they're good at, what they're not good at. But ideas also have strengths and weaknesses, right? So
Right.
you might put an idea out in there into the world, and it's not that everyone that has any negative impressions about that idea are commenting on the idea as a whole, but there might be elements of that idea where, as people are critiquing that, or I mean, criticize
Hmm.
wrong word, but you're
Hmm.
going to be able to make that idea better, or shift it, or let it grow into what it will eventually become. So
Right.
ultimately, I think that, becoming a successful entrepreneur, yes, there's a lot of, characteristics that you need to be able to foster within yourself. I mean, chief, and I mean, it's confidence, right? And not
Yeah.
being scared. No, I mean,
Yeah.
ultimately, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you need to accept the fact that 95% of the responses you're going to get from people are going to be no. I've
Hmm.
raised money a number of times. I've pitched television shows before my new career, like hundreds of times. And the reality is you get no 95% more than you get yes.
Well, and I
Uh,
think, I spent 17 years in corporate sales. So, I mean, I got really used to hearing no and like getting beat up and, dealing with objections, like real and imaginary ones. And I don't necessarily think it gets easier, but it gets easier to pick yourself up faster, right? Like when someone is
yes.
like, or it gets easier to recognize when something is real or if somebody's just like trying to, get you out the door, right? But I think that's it's a
And
key to being successful in all of this.
I don't necessarily know. I don't know if I agree. I don't know if it's easier. Like
Hmm.
a lot of my life I model after my experience playing sports.
Right. Me too.
So you watch LeBron James after
Hmm.
he loses a basketball game. How
Right.
many basketball games has he won? Hundreds, thousands.
Mm-hmm.
How many
Hmm.
championships has he won? Look at Michael Jordan. I mean, case in point. He loses a game, he's pissed off. It's not
Right.
easy,
No.
right? When I lose, when I get told no, I'm pissed. I'm angry. I'm upset.
Hmm.
Is it
Hmm.
easier for me to accept? It might be easier for me to get over it, but the
Right.
moment is not easy. The moment is never easy. And the moment that, whenever that moment is easy, then you know you're fucked, because you
Yeah.
never want losing or getting a
No.
no to be easy. What you want
I love that.
is,
Nick's like, wait, what did I say? What did I
yeah, yeah.
say?
Oh, no, no. I
But no,
remember what it is now.
listen, I love that you went to sports because that's how I'm wired too, right? And everything, that I do either in business or that, in my previous career or even with my family, like it all comes down to sports for me and that like so I love that analogy and I think you're right. Like when you it's I don't like losing.
No,
I don't like no. I don't like it at all. But I think that you get smarter as you
yep,
get older. You get smarter as you like lose more, again back to the sports analogy, and you have more takeaways, right? Like
100%.
you learn what you need to take from it. When I think back to when I was playing sports, when I was playing rugby, when I was 20 versus when I was coaching when I was 35, the lessons are very different, right? And I would, definitely probably take a loss like harder and more personally when I was younger, but you're right. Like I think it's figuring out what you need to learn from the no or the lesson or
Yep.
the opportunity not working out the way that you wanted it to.
That's
So,
right, because you want to make that recovery
yes,
from the inevitable no. You need to
exactly.
accept the fact you're going to get told no a lot,
Right?
but how do
Yeah.
you bounce back more
Yeah.
efficiently, right?
Yeah.
And more constructively, right?
Yeah.
So, and you were a physical trainer. I mean, when somebody
Yeah.
gets injured the first time, you go and you help them get better. You help them recover. The
Yeah.
next time they get injured, that person's going to know, oh, or there's steps they can take
Yeah.
to prevent that next injury. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
oh no, every analogy I use is all about, I won't even get into my
No.
building a business through rugby, because I believe that
Ooh.
rugby is the greatest analogy on how you want to build the right team and the
Yeah.
right business, because of the way that the sport of rugby is
Yeah.
structured.
Yeah.
But we can we can talk
Well,
about
no,
that
and
down
listen,
the road too.
I was just talking about this yesterday with somebody else actually about, how a lot of people in business just want to they just want to go right to being an expert in this thing, or they want to, they want to go do niche something or whatever. And I'm like, but it all starts with the basics, right?
Yep.
And I mean, I take that from my days as either a rugby player or like playing sports. Like, you don't get really good at doing the finesse stuff unless you got the basics down, right?
Yep.
And I think, and that applies to the business world too. And so, again, it depends on who you're talking to. Not everybody's into sports, but it definitely, rugby definitely shaped who I am as a person and the business person that I've become too.
Yeah, well, I'll close the loop on that analogy. Is
Mm-hmm.
the reason why, to me, rugby is such a great example on, or the sport of rugby and how the team operates within a rugby game, is within rugby. For those of you that aren't familiar with the sport, the game doesn't stop, right?
Right.
It's a flowing game. Unlike football, where you could be an offensive lineman, you have your singular job that you have to do for 15 seconds. All you have to do is you need to pull and block the outside linebacker. That's your
Yeah.
job. If you
Yeah.
do that job, then your team can have success.
Mm-hmm.
In rugby, it doesn't work like that. Because the game doesn't stop, all 15 people on a rugby field need to be in sync with one another. They need to understand what each person's role is at any given time during the game, because as the game evolves, they need to be able to adapt and work together to score a try. It's
Yeah.
not like, as a rugby player, I have my one job to do over 15 seconds. Because the game is flowing, everybody has to have their role, but also everybody has to be willing to adapt. It's like being an entrepreneur. You need to
Mm-hmm.
be willing to adapt. The best entrepreneurs that I've ever met are pseudo jack of all trades, masters of
Yes.
none, right?
Right.
You
Right.
can be an incredible entrepreneur without being an expert in something. What you need to be
Absolutely.
aware of is you need to be willing to be a part of a team. You need to
Mm-hmm.
be to identify other people that you want to play or work with, and you need
Right.
to be willing to listen to them, to work with them, and allow them to express their strengths and
Mm-hmm.
understand their weaknesses, right? If one person's
Absolutely.
strong, one person's fast, one person can catch, one person's not as great at catching. You need to be able to work and flow together to be able to
Yeah.
build the business or a team the right way. But anyway,
Yes.
um,
Love it.
so
I
yeah,
didn't know this was going to go in a rugby direction, but I shouldn't be surprised.
everything, well, I mean, I work in sports now, and I'm an obsessive rugby player. Oh, rugby sevens on CBC, 2:30 Eastern.
Oh, that's
um,
awesome.
there you go. So there's the CBC plug for you.
There you go.
So I mean, back to basically. So I came up with that idea for here. I'm going to bring it all the way back full circle. I came up
Right.
to the idea with that TV show about sleepaway camps. Got some money. Never did any TV show before, but I located and found people in Ottawa, where I was living, who had made TV shows before, and I convinced them to come and join me on this journey, because I didn't know what I was doing. So I had to
Right.
find other young people that could fit within the summer camp world to come with me
Right.
along this journey. These people have all become some of my closest friends in the world, and this was back in 1999.
Okay.
So we're talking about over 20 years ago. Uh, so went off, we did this show, put together the first episode of the show, and I was like, oh, I got to go and sell it. So I literally, I took a train from Montreal to Toronto to come and pitch all the TV stations.
Yep.
Funny side note to this story: on the train from Montreal to Toronto to pitch my very first television show,
Uh-huh.
train 5:30 in the morning, leaving to Toronto. I take a seat. 10 minutes later, somebody walks onto the train, sits down next to me, and now she's my wife. That's how we met, and we've been
I
married
love
for over
that.
15 years. Yeah, so I met my wife, Lori, literally on the train. She came and sat down next to me, and I we talked for about 5-6 hours, and now she's my
That's
wife.
amazing.
So
Love
yeah,
it.
so I came to Toronto, pitched my first television show, and it was a resounding no. Everybody
Yeah.
gave me a no.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I was 25 at the time, 24 at the time, And the way the Canadian, I won't get into the reasons and the whys what the Canadian media system works, but effectively what I had done was I'd created a show about what it's like in sleepaway camps,
Okay.
the real life of sleepaway camps. I called this show a pop documentary. So I was pitching the show in the spring. I forget what the year was. I think 2000, the spring of 2000. And this was, or maybe 2001. And this was the spring before Survivor premiered in September. So the term reality television didn't exist. So nobody knew what the hell it was that I had done. They're like, what do you mean? What's a pop documentary? So of course, if reality television had already existed, I would have called it reality television. But because that show was turned down, but one of the people that I pitched the show to, Family Channel, they said, hey, we're not going to air this show, but we're trying to figure out a way to rebrand our television station, come up with some ideas. So I came up with an idea for another television show, and they ended up buying it. And I ended up traveling. So it was, I ended up traveling across country, me and two big puppets, and puppeteers. We took a jar of water from the Atlantic Ocean, and we drove across the country to the Pacific Ocean to pour it in to see what would happen. It was called the Family Experiment. It was inspired by What About Bob? I don't know if you remember What About Bob. He had his goldfish. Yeah. So I literally wore a jar of Atlantic Ocean water around my neck for a month, traveling across the country in a motorhome.
Wow.
The two puppeteers are still two of my closest friends. One of the puppeteers ended up leaving film and television, got his master's of theology from Trinity College, ended up marrying my wife and I.
That's amazing.
So then I did the Family Channel show for a while, did some production stuff. When I was doing the Family Channel stuff, there was a show on TSN at the time called Off the Record that was hosted by Michael Landsberg. Yes. And at that time, they had all these like B-level celebrities on the show. So at that point, I was probably a D-level celebrity, but I also played sports. And as I've said before, I like to talk. So I'm not scared of shit. So I called up or I emailed, I think I probably called the producer at this point. No, I emailed the producer of Off the Record and said, hey, I'm on TV and I like sports. Can I do your show? And they said, sure. So I came and I did the show once. Make a long story short, they always like to have fighters or debaters on that show, people who would take the opposite angle of any topic. So I was like, I can do that, sure. So the amount of times I was on Canadian national television talking about how I think steroids would be good in sports as opposed to bad in sports. Like, yes, I would like to see a 600-foot home run. Who wouldn't want to see a 600-foot home run? I'm not taking steroids. I don't care. Anyway, I didn't really believe that. Drugs are bad, kids. But anyway, that's kind of what I did. So I started talking about sports on television, and then at this time I was still making TV shows, and I was making at that point I started making like branded content for other companies like the Atlantic Ballet of Canada, like Puma, like Elections Canada. And I was at that point I was getting obsessed with something called fantasy sports. And I was talking with the producer of Fantasy Sports one day, who also happened to be a fantasy sport, of Off the Record one day, who also happened to be a fantasy sports fan. And I looked at her and I'm like, why don't no one's doing a fantasy sports show. Like, why don't we do a show? Like, let's do a fantasy sport. Well, we can do it right here. And the producer and I started talking, and we realized we could like Off the Record shot for 1 hour. But they had the crew in the studio for 2 hours. So the producer was like, and this was like his idea. I was like, well, why don't we can probably just shoot it right here with the same crew? And anyway, we pitched it to people at TSN, and they're like, sure. And so I did that for a couple of years, but that got me thinking about media and fantasy sports, and how those two things could play together. And so effectively, at that point, I came up with an idea of how to create a fantasy game or a fantasy product that would allow broadcasters to increase the value of what they were offering on television. This was kind of this was around 2005, 2006, when people had their phones and their computers, and broadcasters started thinking about, well, there's TVs on, but they're also looking at their other screens, called multi-screen entertainment, right? People are on Facebook or on Twitter when games are on. They're playing games with their phone. They're not necessarily watching the television advertising, because ultimately television is driven by ad sales and sponsor sales, right?
Yeah.
It still is, even though that's stupid because nobody watches commercials anymore. But because the broadcast industry is so fucking antiquated and it's run by 70-year-old people that want to protect.
How do you really feel, Nick?
I hate it. I hate the broadcast world, especially the Canadian broadcast world, because it doesn't give young people a chance. Anyway, sorry, I'm about to go off. Yeah, filter.
Reel
I'm
it back in,
bringing
Nic.
myself
Bringing it back in.
See, pre-married Nic would have just gone off, but I've been living with an incredible woman who's taught me that I need to bring myself
Thank you
back.
for listening to part 1 of Dare to Transform, episode 3, Learning to Fight and Find Your Way. I'm Angela Harris, and this has been Dare to Transform, a Missing Link Technologies podcast in collaboration with Work of Heart. Have a great day.